Part 2, timelines, snapping and collapsing. So I'll bring back to this image that is starting this conversation about timeline splitting that many of you gave me really interesting comments about. And this came in, as I said, in 2014, and it keeps showing up for me. And it kind of is like one of those drawings that stays with you. It almost becomes one of your archetypal images. I have ladders. Some people have spirals. You know, there's forms that stick with us. They just kind of stick, and you just end up having to draw them again. We all have those scribbles. But this was, you know, a drawing that stayed with me so strongly. Even after I lost it, I had to make it again. But this time it had a variation, which was this 2 chords wrapping. And as I talked about in the last video, I talked about timeline splitting. But what's important to understand is that in this splitting, you know, these timelines, which I explained as frequency, these frequencies that are starting to split and we're starting to make decisions about have been bound and wound together for millennium, like a very long time. Very, very long time. And it's not that the split is taking place right now exclusively. This is something that's going to evolve maybe over 1,000 years, maybe over several hundred years in linear time. But the way that you do it is timeless. You know, there's a sort of like how you choose to do it is going to determine where you're going to be, you know, as a soul, or your ancestors will be, your future ancestors will be in 100 or 1,000 years. So timeline, what we first went about, timeline collapsing. Let's talk about this. Timeline collapsing. Timeline collapsing, when I talked about, you know, we're present here, but we're also simultaneously existing in multiple frequencies of the past and the future. And there's a timeline of a wound in this time, or an ancestral or an Akashic wound. It could be influencing very greatly your moment-to-moment living. It could be having this very strong thing, but when you go in and you start to do the shadow work and the healing and the therapy and the, you know, the investigation, the vagal traumatic work, you know, you do this stuff, this timeline this frequency may actually sort of start to dissipate, and it may collapse into the higher frequency of your moment-to-moment existing. So there can be a collapse of other timelines, and that is part of our sort of privilege and job right now, which is to collapse the timelines that don't facilitate life and evolution and frequency that we would like to exist in, the frequency that we sort of prophesized to exist in, that we came to bless the earth and our ancestors and our future generations and everything with. When we begin to do our shadow and healing work, and this is really deep and dark work. When you do this work, it's not like I release it. No, you go in and you actually alchemize through therapy or EMDR or some sort of work. You alchemize that timeline, that frequency of the pain that your ancestors or you or Akashic memory is embedded in you, and you shift it so much that the frequency of that no longer influences and has an effect on the current moment. You suddenly are existing just in the now with the pure brightness of your true nature. The Queen leaving, is this a timeline collapse? In a sense, it's a collapse of one frequency, her frequency, but everything that's been taking place for the 70 years of her reign has not left yet. So unfortunately, this is not a complete collapse, because the frequency and the impact that she had, she put in her prime minister, etc., that's not a collapse. But there can be collective collapses, timeline collapses, collective frequency changes. For example, when a society decides to give rights to a certain population or a river, or, you know, decides to clean up the environment, that can collapse the timeline of destruction and injustice and inequity and, you know, war. When a war ends, that might be a timeline collapse, though that will go on for some time before it's fully collapsed, maybe generations. So that's timeline collapsing, but it's a shifting of the frequency of something so that it, you know, the moment right now, because all we actually have is a now, as I pointed out, here we are now, we've got the past and the future, it's all happening here simultaneously, but we are purifying, sort of clearing the frequency so that we can become more present in the now. Timeline snapping, it can go both directions, and it's in service to our evolution, trust me, but it's so difficult. For example, you go home to your family and you are triggered by a set of illusions, delusions, contracts, events, trauma, and you are just immediately, you've left your adult conscious, meditating holy self, and you are a child in the womb. Maybe on the exterior you look like you're still yourself, but on the inside you are totally in another timeline. You are snapped into your childhood trauma or your ancestral trauma or your past life trauma. So you've snapped there. So how do you get out of that? Because that snapping is happening left and right, Well, you go into a place where you can sort of step outside of time and become a witness. Your meditation, you move into the timeless activities, your meditation, your art making, your music making, your love making, your gardening, your caregiving, your communication with animals. And you work through your stuff in that moment to kind of heal it. And it might take weeks, might take months, it might take years, but as soon as you heal those things in that, other resonance, you snap yourself back into place. You snap yourself back into place. So think about, how do you do timeline snapping? How do you do frequency snapping when you find yourself pulled out? Because right now we are being pulled out of our sort of prophecy and clarity, and we're being timeline snapped into the old stuff, so that we can actually bring it up into the frequency that we need it to be. And many of us were born into families where the frequency was completely off, and we are going back into those, places so that we can bring it in to frequency, higher frequency, aligned frequency, timeline snap. Frequency snaps, which is not always a snap, but in any case. All right, that's the end of part 2. Part 3 to come. Love you. Bye.